Hey, what are we doing for the Christmas episode this year?
Don't worry, I have it covered.
You want us to review the movie Elf. You're a genius. Greetings, cold ones, and welcome to Codex Compliant.
While the weather outside is frightful, let's look at some elves that are also frightful.
Dark Elves have been in Warhammer Fantasy Battle since nearly the very beginning, first appearing in Forces of Fantasy in 1984 to fill the role of Elves, (evil). And unlike some factions from that era that would become little more than interesting background elements to harken back to whenever Games Workshop was feeling saucy, the Dark Elves would get a whole army book during the 4th edition of the game, the first edition to have such things, and that book is what we're looking at today.
1995's Warhammer Armies Dark Elves was written by Jervis Johnson and, like so many books we've covered from the 90s, has cover art by David Gallagher. Cover art that shows a lot more flesh than you often see on Warhammer books. And as much as I want to comment on how this witch elf looks like she's engaging in a who has the tiniest pants in Warhammer competition with Lilith Hesperax, I'm more drawn to comment on how adorable her cornate gnome hat is, and to wonder what's going on with her pose. And as to why she has a cornate hat at all, we'll get back to that later. Oh, and before we go any further, as this book is elf-related and arrived at our home in remarkably good condition, this is another one that was sent to us by our good buddy Seamus. So, thank you, Seamus.
The Dark Elves are described as the most pure evil faction in the Warhammer world, revelling in unspeakable acts such as torture and picking up your miniatures without asking.
Dude, what the hell?
Things they do not out of any particular agenda, just purely for the love of the game. They split from the High Elves over 5,000 years previously when Malekith, the son of the first Phoenix King, began to experiment with dark magic which warped him physically and mentally, leading to him being passed over as king when his father died. This eventually led to a civil war between Malekith's followers and everybody else. It did not go well for anyone, and Malekith and his followers left to form a new cold and bleak homeland called Naggaroth.
These Dark Elves do not worship the full pantheon of the elven gods, only Kayla Mensha Kane, the bloody-handed god of war, murder, hatred, and destruction. Which explains a lot about them. They're really into slavery and finding new and creative ways of sacrificing people. They're also into boats, because remember when Man o' War was a thing? Now, as people who didn't really know much about Dark Elves going into this book, we did wonder what was going on with the Witch Elves with the corn symbols on them, since despite those being prominent enough to feature on the front cover, they don't actually mention it anywhere in the book. However, if you go back to White Dwarf 108 from 1988, you find an article all about Witch Elves which lays it out pretty simply. Witch Elves were an ancient order who turned from the worship of Slaanesh to worship Cain, who is described as an aspect of the god known to other races as the Chaos god Khorne. Now, out of universe, Cain became his own thing separate to Khorne, but retaining many similarities. And also, their later minis would lose all of those Khornate symbols. Thinking about it though, if Cain was still an aspect of Khorne, that would make the inclusion of the Daughters of Cain into the Order Grand Alliance in Age of Sigmar even odder than it already is.
Onto the army list, and for those that weren't there at the time or haven't seen one of the many videos we've made covering this era of Warhammer, the way an army was arranged was that you could have a certain percentage of your force's points be a certain thing. These can vary a little between books, but here it's a fairly standard 50% can be characters, at least 25% need to be regiments, and you can have up to 25% be war machines, monsters, or allies respectively. The first character in this book is the mandatory Dark Elf General. Well, mandatory unless you have a special character in their role. They're a general-purpose leader character who can be put on a steed of various kinds, including the obligatory cold one. Don't mind me just cracking open a boy with the cold ones. Is that anything? And like most characters of the time, can be kitted out with sufficient equipment and magic items to satiate your hero hammer desires. You can also have battle standard bearers to help you re-roll failed break tests, heroes and champions, sorcerers who come in a few flavours depending on your budget, and assassins. Assassins were interesting, not just because their attacks cause D3 damage, and with initiative 10 and weapon skill 9 he is absolutely going to hit you, but because they could also be hidden inside your units, only revealed once you got them into close combat with the enemy, where they will hit you because, again, initiative 10, weapon skill 9.
For regiments, there's Cold War Knights, elite knights mounted on in-universe fear-inducing, but out-of-universe very adorable, slimy reptiles who are kind of stupid. There's Dark Riders, who are cavalry on horses which aren't dinosaurs, so who cares. Executioners wield double-handed axes that also do the D3 wounds thing the assassins could. There's crossbowmen, spearmen, and warriors for all your basic shooty and stabby needs, as well as city guard should you need a basic unit that was both a bit shooty and a bit stabby. You could also have a single unit of the Black Guard of Nagroth for slightly more elite stabbiness. However, if you still have things left unstabbed, you have Witch Elves who dual-wield poisoned blades, which added +1 to the strength of an attack, and are always frenzied because... I mean, look at them! Then there's Scouts who could scout ahead during deployment. Corsairs have Sea Dragon Cloaks whose 5+ saves couldn't be modified by attacker's strength, and finally, for regiments, there's Harpies who are these scrungly looking things that can fly.
For war machines you could take repeater bolt throwers, also repeater bolt throwers, and a single Cauldron of Blood. The Cauldron of Blood, not to be confused with the Cauldron of Blood, the Cornate demon engine from Epic, is a big pot full of the blood of the Witch Elves victims that never overflows no matter how much is poured in there, which hag queens bathe in to renew their lost beauty, emerging naked and bloody, lithe and strong once more. A sentence that's definitely activated a non-zero amount of the people watching this. In-game, however, it was just a big goofy pot that made Witch Elves' frenzy even more frenzied. Well, until they got tired, anyway. Oh, and nearby Witch Elves sometimes didn't die because it was magic. The monsters available are pretty much the same as the monsters available to all factions. So if you want your Dark Elf army to be 25% swarms of lizards, snakes and frogs, you can just do that. But they did have a unique one, the War Hydra. A big multi-headed beastie who had a flame attack that strength was equal to the amount of wounds that it had left. Finally, a Dark Elf army could take allies chosen from the Chaos, Undead and Orc and Goblin books, should your army not already be sufficiently spiky, dead or green.
There were a few special rules applied to the army as a whole too. Rules dedicated entirely to how much they hate High Elves. Dark Elves hate them to the point they have the Hatred special rule when fighting them, and if Dark Elf units are near any High Elf units, they need to take an obedience test on a d6. By rolling a 1, they fail and will disobediently charge the nearest High Elf unit, or failing that, just move towards them as quickly as possible. Which I think is the wargaming equivalent of bucking at someone. As was already tradition for these books, there are special characters. The first is Malekith, the Witch King of Nagaroth. In-game, he was a frightening sorcerer riding a chariot, although you were on your own for making a mini since they never made one for this iteration of him. Next, we have the Beast Lord Rakarth of Karandkar. He rides a large black dragon into battle and has the Whip of Agony, a melee weapon that does additional attacks on top of your regular ones but can't actually kill anyone. It just hurts a lot, so they need to take a leadership test to be able to attack back that turn. Fun little element to him is that his black dragon is called Brachus, named after his previous steed. Brachus I was a horse that belonged to his father who couldn't tame it, and was nearly trampled to death when he tried. Frustrated, his father ordered Brachus to be destroyed, but an 8-year-old Rakarth asked if he could have an attempt at taming the wild stallion, and that if he succeeded, he might keep the horse. His father agreed because, and I quote, "Dark Elves love all forms of gambling, even above the safety of their own children." Aww. Rakarth obviously managed it, and his ability to tame animals even manifested in-game, with any monsters he won or drew a round of close combat against being tamed by him and joining the Dark Elf side.
Morathi, the hag sorceress and Malekith's mum, who at this point was not 75% winged serpent, rides into battle on a dark Pegasus named Sulafet. She has a sword that, upon scoring a wound, also permanently lowers the opponent's weapon skill and bow skill, which feels a little insulting. There's also Kuran, the captain of the Black Guard, who is... well, he's the captain of the Black Guard. Crone Hellebrond, the Hag Queen, who fights on the back of a manticore with a pair of magic weapons, something you usually can't have in pairs. One is a parrying blade that makes one enemy per turn lose an attack, and the other is the Death Sword. It gives her strength 10. You can see why it's called the Death Sword. Then there's Talaris of Harganeth, who is a special executioner, and finally there's Shadowblade, Master of Assassins, a young and spry 150-year-old assassin who occasionally explodes if poked too hard. Interestingly, he's so good at disguising, he can not only hide within your units like a regular assassin can, but can do it in your opponent's units too, although you need to roll a d6 to see if the disguise works, and how easy the roll is depends on how hard it would be to pull off that particular disguise. So, for example, it's easier for him to pretend to be another kind of elf than it is a Skaven, for hopefully obvious reasons.
Going into the colour section, one thing you may notice is that the miniatures all feel a little basic. And I don't mean that the minis look bad, they fit in well with the overall mini line at the time. I just mean that there's no miniatures of named characters or anything that's bigger than a cavalry model. There's nothing special. Now this is just because those minis either hadn't been released yet, or in the case of some named characters, never would be in this form. For example, the Beastlord Rakarth mini was both a named character and very large, but wouldn't be released until a few months after the book came out. With slightly smaller yet still impressive minis, like the Sorceress riding a Dark Pegasus showing up after that. This all means that it feels like the book is missing something, and so many of the fancier units you can use just aren't represented. How are you supposed to fully appreciate how silly the Cauldron of Blood is if you can't see one? But to talk about what is here, rather than to complain about what isn't, there are still some interesting sights to see. For example, there's the Cold One minis that were in their first exclusively bipedal theropod dinosaur looking phase. This was not long after Jurassic Park came out, dinosaurs were all the rage, so it makes sense. The previous versions were giving more giant fantasy lizard, and the version after this was, well, rotund and low to the ground. After that, the more modern sculpts went back to them being theropod dinosaurish things again. It seems like there was not a lot of confidence about how Cold Ones should look over at Citadel, so it took a bit of back and forth to settle on something.
The Harpies are also interesting since they're very, well, not what I think of as Harpies, being more knobbly creatures than the tits-out bird people you usually think of, and indeed would replace them when minis of them were redone later. I wonder if this is just a Citadel thing. Were there any Harpy miniatures they made before these? Apparently yes, and oh Jesus, that is a lot. I kinda want one. As an aside, since this has nothing to do with Dark Elves really, and when else will this come up, there's also Bob Ollie's more conventional tits-out Harpies that were released by Citadel under the Iron Claw brand sometime around the late 80s. They're apparently based on Ronald and Nancy Reagan, and Margaret Thatcher. Look, if I have to know this, then so do you. To return to the book, it's also pretty funny how none of the standard bearers can see where they're going at all. Although this is not a trait unique to these particular minis or anything, it did mean that your paint job is mostly going to be covered with a flag, which would have annoyed me to no end. Plus, we do appreciate these pages of shield and banner designs, along with the big full-colour map. I suppose it's easier to include such things when you don't need to print full pages of giant dragons, since you haven't made those minis yet. The back of the book features tactics advice, which is always appreciated and great for new players who tend to struggle with hard-hitting but fragile armies like the Dark Elves, along with a fully detailed 2,000-point army list, which again is always useful, even if I keep misreading the general's name as Karl. There's also some banners to photocopy, so at least the flags entirely obscuring your standard bearers are on model. And, as was normal for the time, a catalogue section so you can get a good look at the Dark Elf miniature range in its individual parts, most of which was by Ali Morrison, with help from Colin Dixon and Trish Carden.
And so, with that, we draw our time with Warhammer Armies Dark Elves to a close. What have we learned? Well, that sometimes elves can be a little cornate as a treat, that Dark Elves love gambling more than their own children, and that it might be worth having at least a single centerpiece unit ready to go upon release of a new rulebook. Following this book, the Dark Elves would stick around for the rest of Warhammer Fantasy's life, before being heavily reworked into the Daughters of Cain for Age of Sigmar. And by heavily reworked, we mean they're just the Witch Elf faction now. But they still do have the Cauldrons of Blood, and Marathi has a giant snake ass now, so that's kind of fun.
Also, I think it's safe to say there's more than a little Dark Elf in the Dark Eldar from 40k who would appear 3 years after this book was released. There's some shared aesthetics and theming in there. The Drukhari of the Grimdark future just have a slightly more reasonable reason for being 500% more into torture than those around them would prefer. Hell, the Drukhari even have their own melee specialist witches, although theirs is spelled with a Y, presumably for branding reasons. But with all that said, thank you very much for sticking with us for another year.
Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, and should you encounter any elves during the festive period, may they not be Dark Elves. I mean, unless you're into that kind of thing.
Hello, thank you for watching. If you enjoyed it, please let us know with a like, a comment, or if you're new here, maybe consider subscribing. We're getting annoyingly close to 60k subs, and it'd be nice to finally crack that. Also, if you'd like to financially support what we do here, then head on over to patreon.com/snipeandwib. By helping us make these videos, you'll get early access to them, as well as the occasional bit of exclusive content and your name in the end credits, just like the ones you see scrolling past your eyeballs. Hope you all have a pleasant festive season and you get all the presents that you want. Especially that one. You know the one. Anyway, you all take care and we'll see you next time.
Don't eat it. No. Just, no. Even as a joke, I'm like,